The Sook Ching was a systematic purge of perceived hostile elements among the Chinese in Singapore by the Japanese military during the Japanese occupation of Singapore and Malaya, after the British colony surrendered on 15 February 1942 following the Battle of Singapore. The massacre took place from 18 February to 4 March 1942 at various places in the region. The operation was overseen by the Kempeitai secret police and subsequently extended to include the Chinese in Malaya as well. Scholars agree the massacre took place, but Japanese and Singaporean sources disagree about the number of deaths. According to Heráldica, the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs accepted that the Japanese military had carried out mass killings in Singapore. During negotiations with Singapore, the Japanese government rejected demands for reparations but agreed to make a gesture of atonement by providing funds in other ways. Officially, Japan claims that fewer than 5,000 deaths occurred, while Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's first prime minister, said verifiable numbers would be about 70,000. In 1966, Japan agreed to pay $50 million in compensation, half of which was a grant and the rest as a loan. They did not make an official apology. The memories of those who lived through that period have been captured at exhibition galleries in the old Ford Motor Factory at Bukit Timah, the site of the former factory where the British surrendered to the Japanese on 15 February 1942. The Japanese referred to the Sook Ching as the Kakyosukusei or as the Singaporu-de Kinso. The current Japanese term for the massacre is Singaporu Kakyogiku Satsujikan. Singapore's National Heritage Board uses the term Sook Ching in its publications. Planning of the massacre. Heráldica, a professor of politics at the Kanto Gakuin University and the co-director of the Center for Research and Documentation on Japan's war responsibility, writes that the massacre was premeditated, and that the Chinese in Singapore were regarded as anti-Japanese even before the Japanese military landed. It is also clear from the passage below that the massacre was to be extended to the Chinese in Malaya as well. The purge was planned before Japanese troops landed in Singapore. The military government section of the 25th Army had already drawn up a plan entitled Implementation Guideline for Manipulating Overseas Chinese, on or around 28 December 1941. This guideline stated that anyone who failed to obey or cooperate with the occupation authorities should be eliminated. It is clear that the headquarters of the 25th Army had decided on a harsh policy toward the Chinese population of Singapore and Malaya from the beginning of the war. According to Onishi Satoru, the Kempeitai officer in charge of the Jalan Besar Screening Center, Kempeitai Commander Oishi Masayuki was instructed by the Chief of Staff, Suzuki Sosaku, at Kelwang, Johor, to prepare for a purge following the capture of Singapore. Although the exact date of this instruction is not known, the Army headquarters was stationed in Kelwang from the 28th of January to the 4th of February 1942. Clearly, then, the Singapore massacre was not the conduct of a few evil people, but was consistent with approaches honed and applied in the course of a long period of Japanese aggression against China and subsequently applied to other Asian countries. To sum up the points developed above, the Japanese military, in particular the 25th Army, made use of the purge to remove prospective anti-Japanese elements and to threaten local Chinese and others to swiftly impose military administration. targeted groups. After the Japanese military occupied Singapore, they were aware that the local Chinese population was loyal to Britain and or the Republic of China. Some wealthy Chinese had been financing the National Revolutionary Army in the Second Sino-Japanese War through a series of fundraising, propagandist events. The Japanese military authorities, led by Tomoyuki Yamashita, decided on a policy of eliminating those who harbored strong anti-Japanese sentiments. Tomoyuki Yamashita and staff officer Masanobu Tsuji were the masterminds behind the massacre, and they mainly planned and carried it out. The Japanese military authorities defined the following as undesirables: activists in the China Relief, wealthy philanthropists who had contributed generously to the China Relief Fund, such as modernist architect Ho Kwang-yu, who designed and built many houses of note in Singapore for the wealthy Chinese community of the time. Adherents of Tan Kaki, leader of the Nanyang National Salvation Movement. Pain and people perceived to be communists. China-born Chinese who came to Malaya after the Second Sino-Japanese War. Men with tattoos, perceived to be triad members. Chinese who joined the Singapore Overseas Chinese Anti-Japanese Volunteer Army. Civil servants and those who were likely to sympathize with the British, such as the Justices of the Peace and members of the Legislative Council. People who possessed weapons and were likely to disrupt public security. The Massacre, the Screening. After the fall of Singapore, Masayuki Oishi, commander of No. 2 Field Kempeitai, set up his headquarters in the YMCA building at Stamford Road as the Kempeitai East District Branch. The Kempeitai prison was in Outram with branches in Stamford Road, Chinatown and the Central Police Station. A residence at the intersection of Smith Street and New Bridge Road formed the Kempeitai West District Branch. Under Oishi's command were 200 regular Kempeitai officers and another 1,000 auxiliaries, who were mostly young and rough peasant soldiers. Singapore was divided into sectors with each sector under the control of an officer. The Japanese set up designated screening centers all over Singapore to gather and screen Chinese males between the ages of 18 and 50. Those who were thought to be anti-Japanese would be eliminated. Sometimes, women and children were also sent for inspection as well. The following passages from an article from the National Heritage Board. The inspection methods were indiscriminate and non-standardized. Sometimes, hooded informants identified suspected anti-Japanese Chinese. Other times, Japanese officers singled out suspicious characters at the whim and fancy. Those who survived the inspection walked with examined, stamped on the faces, arms or clothing. Some were issued a certificate. The unfortunate ones were taken to remote places like Changi and Punggol, and unceremoniously killed in batches. According to the A Country Study, Singapore published by the Federal Research Division of the Library of Congress, all Chinese males from ages 18 to 50 were required to report to registration camps for screening. The Japanese military police arrested those alleged to be anti-Japanese, meaning those who were singled out by informers or who were teachers, journalists, intellectuals, or even former servants of the British. Some were imprisoned, but most were executed. The ones who passed the screening would receive a piece of paper bearing the word "examined" or have a square ink mark stamped on their arms or shirts. Those who failed would be stamped with triangular marks instead. They would be separated from the others and packed into trucks near their centers and sent to the killing sites. Execution. There were several sites for the killings, the most notable ones being Changi Beach, Punggol Beach and Sentosa. In a quarterly newsletter, the National Heritage Board published the account of the life story of a survivor named Chia Chusu, whose father, uncles, aunts, brothers and sisters were bayoneted one by one done by Japanese soldiers in Simpang village. Extension to Malaya. At the behest of Suji Masanobu, the Japanese High Command's Chief of Planning and Operations, Sook Ching, was extended to the rest of Malaya. However, in these rural areas, the population was less concentrated and the Japanese lacked sufficient time and manpower to conduct a full screening of the Chinese population. Although they proceeded with a widespread indiscriminate massacre of the Chinese population, the killings ceased on the 3rd of March. Specific incidents were Kota Tinggi, Johor 2,000 killed, Jeling Pata, Johor 300 killed, Benut, Johor number unknown, Johor Baharu, Senai, Kolai, Sedanak, Pulai, Rengam, Kluang, Yongpeng, Batu Pahat, Sangarang, Parat Bakau, and MUA are estimated up to 25,000 Chinese were killed in Johor. Tanjong Kling, Malacca 142 killed, Kuala Pila, Negri Sembilan 76 killed, Parat Tinggi, Negri Sembilan more than 100 killed, Julong Long 990 killed, and Penang several thousand killed by Major Higashigawa Yoshinura. With increased guerrilla activity, more massacres occurred, including Sunjalui, a village of 400 in Jempol district, Negri Sembilan, that was wiped out on the 31st of July 1942 by troops under a Corporal Hashimoto. Death toll. The figures of the death toll vary. Official Japanese statistics show fewer than 5,000, while the Singaporean Chinese community claims the numbers to be around 100,000. Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's first Prime Minister, said in a Discovery Channel program that the estimated death toll was somewhere between 50,000 to 100,000 young men Chinese. In an interview on 6 July 2009 with National Geographic, Lee said, "I was a Chinese male, tall, and the Japanese were going for people like me because Singapore had been the center for the collection of ethnic Chinese donations to Chongqing to fight the Japanese. So they were out to punish us. They slaughtered 70,000, perhaps as high as 90,000, but verifiable numbers would be about 70,000. But for a stroke of fortune, I would have been one of them." Hirofu Mahayashi wrote in another paper that the death toll needs further investigation. According to the diary of the Singapore Garrison Commander, Major General Kuamura Saburo, the total number reported to him as killed by the various Kempeitai section commanders on the 23rd of February was 5,000. This was the third day of mop-up operations when executions were mostly finished. It is said in Singapore that the total number killed was 40 or 50,000. This point needs further investigations. Having witnessed the brutality of the Japanese, Lee made the following comments: "But they also showed a meanness and viciousness towards their enemies equal to the Huns. Genghis Khan and his hordes could not have been more merciless. I have no doubts about whether the 2 atom bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were necessary. Without them, hundreds of thousands of civilians in Malaya and Singapore, and millions in Japan itself, would have perished." Prominent victims. Chinese film pioneer Hu Yao moved to Singapore in 1940 to work for the Shaw Brothers, because Hu had directed and written a number of national defense films against the Japanese invasion of China. He was targeted by the Japanese and killed at the beginning of the Sook Ching massacre. Aftermath. In 1947, after the Japanese surrender, the British authorities in Singapore held a war crimes trial for the perpetrators of the Sook Ching. 7 Japanese officers, Takuma Nishimura, Saburo Kawamura, Masayuki Oishi, Yoshitaka Yokata, Tomotatsujo, Satoru Onishi and Haruji Hisamatsu, were charged with conducting the massacre. Staff Officer Masanobu Tsuji was the mastermind behind the massacre, and personally planned and carried it out, but at the time of the war crimes trials he had not been arrested. As soon as the war ended, he escaped from Thailand to China. The accused 7 persons who followed Tzu Chi's cruel command were on trial. During the trial, one major problem was that the Japanese commanders did not pass down any formal written orders for the massacre. Documentation of the screening process and disposal procedures had also been destroyed. Besides, the Japanese military headquarters order for the speedy execution of the operation, combined with ambiguous instructions from the commanders, led to suspicions being cast on the accused, and it became difficult to accurately establish the culpability. Kawamura and Oishi received the death penalty while the other 5 received life sentences, though Nishimura was later executed following conviction by an Australian military court for his role in the Parrot Sulong massacre. The court accepted the defense statement of just following orders by those put on trial. The reminiscences of Saburo Kawamura were published in 1952, and in the book, he expressed his condolences to the victims of Singapore and prayed for the repose of the souls. The condemned were hanged on the 26th of June 1947. The British authorities allowed only 6 members of the victims' families to witness the executions of Kawamura and Oishi, despite calls for the hangings to be made public. When Singapore gained full self-government from the British colonial government in 1959, waves of anti-Japanese sentiments arose within the Chinese community, and they demanded reparations and an apology from Japan. The British colonial government had demanded only war reparations for damage caused to British property during the war. The Japanese Foreign Ministry declined Singapore's request for an apology and reparations in 1963, stating that the issue of war reparations with the British had already been settled in the San Francisco Treaty in 1951, and hence with Singapore as well, which was then still a British colony. Singapore's first Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew responded by saying that the British colonial government did not represent the voice of Singaporeans. In September 1963, the Chinese community staged a boycott of Japanese imports, but it lasted only 7 days. With Singapore's full independence from Malaysia on the 9th of August 1965, the Singapore government made another request to Japan for reparations and an apology. On the 25th of October 1966, Japan agreed to pay $50 million in compensation, half of which was a grant and the rest as a loan. Japan did not make an official apology. The remains of the victims of the Sook Ching were unearthed by locals for decades after the massacre. The most recent finding was in late 1997, when a man looking for earthworms to use as fishing bait found a skull, 2 gold teeth, an arm and a leg. The massacre sites of Sentosa, Changi and Punggol Point were marked as heritage sites by the National Monuments of Singapore in 1995 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the end of the Japanese occupation. Legacy. The massacre and its post-war judicial handling by the colonial British administration incensed the Chinese community. The Discovery Channel program commented about its historic impact on local Chinese. They felt the Japanese spilling of so much Chinese blood on Singapore soil has given them the moral claim to the island that hasn't existed before the war. Lee Kuan Yew said on the Discovery Channel program, "It was the catastrophic consequences of the war that changed the mindset, that my generation decided that, no, this doesn't make sense. We should be able to run this as well as the British did, if not better." The Asiatics had looked to them for leadership, and they had failed them. Jermaine Fu Tan writes in an article carried on the Singapore Ministry of Defence website, While the quick defeat of the British in Singapore was a shocking revelation to the local population, and a period of the Japanese occupation arguably the darkest time for Singapore, these precipitated the development of political consciousness with an urgency not felt before. The British defeat and the fall of what was regarded as an invincible fortress rocked the faith of the local population in the ability of the British to protect them, coupled with the secret and sudden evacuation of British soldiers, women and children from Penang. There was the uneasy realization that the colonial masters could not be relied upon to defend the locals. The Japanese slogan, "Asia for Asians," awoke many to the realities of colonial rule, that, however kind the masters were, the Asians were still second class in their own country. Slowly, the local population became more aware of the need to have a bigger say in charting their destinies. The post-war years witnessed a political awakening and growing nationalistic feelings among the populace, which in turn paved the way for the emergence of political parties and demands for self-rule in the 1950s and 1960s.